Behind closed doors, a private talk changed everything for William and Catherine. The couple battled heavy thoughts knowing that their decision would change more than just their daily lives. It's not about duty alone. Neither is it about public image. Just a situation they never thought they would have to face. Something deeply personal, something that carried real trauma. This decision was not planned and it did not come easy. But what could have convinced them to make such a heartbreaking decision? Join us as we find out what the decision entails and what pushed them beyond reasonable doubt. A meeting of two hearts. The lights in Adelaide Cottage burned long past midnight as William and Catherine remained in their living room. The house finally quiet after putting their 3 children to bed. The couple had been circling around this conversation for weeks, finding excuses to delay what they both knew had to be discussed. Now with the palace expecting an answer, they could no longer avoid facing the decision that would reshape their family's entire future. The comfortable room that usually felt like their sanctuary now seemed smaller, the weight of their responsibility pressing down on them from every direction. Catherine sat curled in the corner of the sofa, still wearing the casual clothes she had changed into after the children's bedtime routine. William paced near the window, occasionally glancing out at the dark as if looking for answers in the shadows. Neither had touched the tea that had grown cold on the table between them. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they had been holding back, all the fears they had been trying to manage separately rather than confronting together. This moment had been inevitable since the palace first presented their request 3 weeks earlier. The decision facing them involved a fundamental restructuring of how they raised their children, particularly George. The palace wanted commitments that would transform their eldest son's daily life, introducing formal training and responsibilities that seemed impossibly heavy for a child his age. William understood the reasoning behind the request. His father and the senior advisors saw the monarchy's future and wanted to ensure proper preparation. They pointed to historical examples and spoke about duty and tradition. But sitting in his own home, thinking about his son sleeping peacefully, those arguments felt distant. Catherine had spent the past weeks researching and thinking, talking to child psychologists discreetly, and watching George carefully for any signs of stress. She had seen how he sometimes asked questions about his future that revealed an awareness no child should carry. The palace's proposal would accelerate everything, removing protections they had carefully built around all 3 children. It would mean earlier and more frequent public appearances, structured education with specific focuses, less time for normal childhood activities, and reduced privacy even within their own home. William had his own memories to contend with. He remembered being George's age and feeling the weight of expectation, the sense that his childhood was something happening to him rather than something he controlled. He remembered his mother's attempts to give him a normal life, and how those moments had felt precious because they were so rare. He had promised himself that his own children would have different experiences, that he would find a way to balance duty with childhood. Now that promise faced its first real test, and he was not certain he had the power to keep it. The palace had presented their request as reasonable and necessary. They framed it as planning rather than pressure, preparation rather than sacrifice. But William and Catherine both understood the reality behind the language. Agreeing would mean surrendering control over significant aspects of their children's lives. It would mean accepting that George's childhood would be shaped by institutional needs rather than parental instincts. It would mean acknowledging that their roles as future king and queen consort took precedence over their roles as mother and father. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She laid out her concerns about the psychological impact, the loss of precious years that could never be recovered, and the example they would be setting for Charlotte and Louis. She spoke about the kind of adults they wanted their children to become and whether the palace's proposal supported or undermined those goals. She questioned whether preparing George for kingship required sacrificing his childhood or whether there might be other approaches the institution had not considered. William listened without interrupting, hearing in her words the same fears that had kept him awake for weeks. He added his own view shaped by lived experience the advisors could never advisors fully understand. He talked about the difference between being raised for duty and being crushed by it. He described the isolation he had felt as a child, the sense that his life belonged to everyone except himself. He admitted his fear that agreeing to the palace's terms would damage his relationship with his children, that they would one day look back and wonder why he had not protected them when he had the chance. The conversation continued as the hours passed, both of them circling the central question from different angles. They discussed the potential consequences of refusing, the disappointment and frustration it would cause within the palace. They acknowledged the pressure that would inevitably follow, the suggestion that they were being difficult or failing to understand their responsibilities. They considered whether there might be compromise positions, partial agreements that might satisfy everyone. Unfortunately, each potential middle ground seemed to collapse under examination, revealing itself as nothing but a slower path to the same destination. As dawn approached, they both understood that the decision had already been made, perhaps before they had even sat down. They had been testing their conviction, making sure they could defend their choice to themselves and each other. Now they just needed the courage to stand behind it. But would they be able to? The pressure from the palace. The palace's initial approach had come through formal channels, a carefully worded memorandum delivered to William's private secretary 3 weeks before that midnight conversation between the couple. The document outlined a comprehensive plan for Prince George's development, framed as forward-thinking preparation for his eventual role. The language was respectful, but the expectation was clear. The king and his senior advisors had made a decision about how the next generation should be prepared, and they anticipated cooperation rather than debate. King Charles had followed up with a private conversation about the proposal in terms of legacy and continuity. He spoke about his own grandfather's approach to royal education and the regrets he carried about certain aspects of his own upbringing. He presented the plan as learning from past mistakes while honoring essential traditions. He emphasized the importance of starting early, of building proper habits and understanding before the weight of actual responsibility arrived. His tone was fatherly and thoughtful, making disagreement seem not just difficult, but somehow disrespectful. The proposal laid out a structured program that would begin now and intensify over the coming years. George would attend specific events chosen for educational value, meeting Commonwealth leaders and participating in ceremonial functions. His academic curriculum would incorporate constitutional history, diplomatic protocol, and leadership training. He would spend regular time at Buckingham Palace, learning the rhythms and requirements of official royal life. The plan even specified appropriate recreational activities, favoring those that built character and public appeal over simple childhood enjoyment. Catherine had requested clarification on many points, trying to understand the reasoning and flexibility within the proposal. The responses had been thorough but inflexible. The palace team had clearly spent considerable time developing their framework, and they presented it as a comprehensive package rather than a list of options. Suggestions for modifications were met with explanations of why each element connected to others, why the timing mattered, why alternatives had already been considered and rejected. This was not a negotiation but a presentation of institutional requirements. Behind the formal communications, other pressures had begun building. Senior royals made comments during family gatherings, observations about the importance of proper preparation, and the dangers of being too protective. The specific elements of the proposal had been developed by a committee of advisors, educators, and constitutional experts. Media coverage began appearing about George's future role. Articles that seemed oddly well-informed about internal palace thinking. The timing felt coordinated, designed to create an environment where agreement seemed inevitable and resistance appeared unreasonable. William recognized the strategy because he had seen it employed throughout his life. The palace had particular skill at making their preferences feel like natural conclusions rather than imposed demands. They built consensus through repetition and assumption. Through creating conditions where alternatives seemed not just wrong but almost foolish. They used loyalty and duty as leverage, making disagreement feel like personal failure rather than difference of opinion. The approach was never aggressive or threatening, which somehow made it more effective. The proposal also came with implicit warnings about the consequences of delayed preparation. The advisors spoke about previous generations who had struggled with their roles, suggesting that inadequate early training explained later difficulties. They referenced public expectations and constitutional requirements, painting cooperation as necessary rather than optional. They emphasized the king's personal investment in the plan, making clear that rejection would disappoint him during a period when father and son were working to build a stronger relationship. Catherine had experienced the palace's persuasive machinery before, but usually regarding her own role and responsibilities. Watching them target her son triggered different instincts. She noticed how the proposal treated George as a future institution rather than a current child. She saw how it prioritized public perception over personal development. How it assumed that royal duty required childhood sacrifice. She recognized the same patterns that had shaped William's upbringing, packaged in modern language but built on the same ideas. The financial implications added another layer of pressure. The proposal came with offers of additional support, expanded staff, and enhanced security arrangements. Refusing would mean continuing with current resources while managing increasing demands. The palace framed this as generous assistance, but Catherine understood it as another form of manipulation. Accepting their help meant accepting their oversight, allowing institutional priorities to override parental choice in ever-widening areas of family life. William had tried discussing modifications with his father during a private lunch, suggesting ways to achieve the palace's goals while preserving more of George's childhood. Charles had listened patiently, but ultimately returned to the original framework. He spoke about his own attempts to modernize the monarchy, the resistance he had faced, and the compromises he had made. He suggested that William was being given opportunities for input that he himself had never received. The implication hung between them that further resistance would be seen as stubborn rather than principled. The deadline for response had been set with careful calculation. The palace needed time to implement their plan before the next major royal event where George's participation had already been scheduled. Holding the decision would constitute refusal, creating awkwardness and requiring explanations. The timeline pressured William and Catherine to decide quickly, limiting their ability to explore alternatives or build support for a different approach. Every passing day brought new reminders of the waiting answer, new subtle suggestions that cooperation was expected and delay was becoming conspicuous. What Catherine really wants. Catherine had spent countless hours thinking about the kind of mother she wanted to be. Long before she had children and increasingly since becoming a parent, she had watched other royal mothers navigate impossible expectations, seeing how some had been criticized for being too protective, while others faced judgment for being too distant. She had studied child development through her early years' work. Now all that knowledge and instinct collided with institutional demands that seemed designed to undermine everything she believed about raising confident, balanced children. Her vision for George, Charlotte, and Louis centered on giving them the strongest possible foundation before gradually introducing the complexities of their royal roles. She wanted them to spend these early years building genuine friendships, discovering their own interests, and developing the internal confidence that would help them handle public scrutiny. She believed that children who felt secure and loved at home could better cope with external pressures later. Rushing them into official duties and formal training would create anxiety and self-consciousness, replacing natural development with performance. Catherine thought constantly about the specific ways the palace proposal would change daily life. George would need to maintain perfect behavior during longer and more frequent public appearances.